Albert Einstein's story doesn't begin in a lecture hall or a lab filled with beakers and equations. It begins in a quiet home in Ulm, Germany, where a small boy struggled to find his words. For years, he barely spoke. His parents, Hermann and Pauline, whispered their fears to each other. Was something wrong with him? They took him to doctors, desperate for answers. But young Albert simply took his time, observing the world in silence, his mind spinning far faster than his tongue ever could. Later in life, Einstein would say that his delayed speech was a gift, that by not talking, he learned to think more deeply. I probed more deeply into the problem than an ordinary child would have, he reflected. It was as if his silence became the cradle of his genius, forcing him to live in his head, to turn thoughts into shapes, time into texture, and ideas into something tangible. In school, Albert was a paradox. He was brilliant but bored. He could solve problems faster than his teachers could explain them. Yet he hated the rigid German education system, its drills, memorization, and blind obedience. To him, the classroom felt like a military barracks. He once said his teachers were like lieutenants in the Prussian army. They demanded conformity. He demanded curiosity. At home, his father ran a small electrical business, and his uncle introduced him to the mysteries of algebra and geometry. Einstein was fascinated by invisible forces, electricity, magnetism, light, things that moved but could not be seen. When he was 5, his father showed him a simple compass. The needle's invisible dance mesmerized him. Something deeply hidden had to be behind things, he later recalled. That compass, ordinary to others, became his first glimpse into the unseen order of the universe. But brilliance rarely walks a straight path. At 16, frustrated by the stifling environment of his Munich school, Einstein made a bold decision. He dropped out. He wanted freedom to think, to learn on his own terms. He renounced his German citizenship to avoid compulsory military service, a system he despised for its blind discipline. The pacifist in him couldn't imagine wearing a uniform or following orders. He dreamed of studying in Switzerland, a country he admired for its democracy and openness. So he applied to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, a top technical college where he hoped to study mathematics and physics. He was confident. After all, numbers were his native language. But fate had other plans. Einstein failed the entrance exam. He aced physics and math, but stumbled badly in French, literature, zoology, and politics. The boy who saw through the secrets of nature couldn't decode human language and social studies. It was a bitter lesson. Genius doesn't exempt you from failure. Yet, even in defeat, opportunity waited. He was advised to complete one more year of schooling in the small Swiss town of Aarau. There, in a gentler system that encouraged imagination and visual thinking, Einstein thrived. The school encouraged students to picture problems, not just memorize them, a method that perfectly suited his visual, intuitive mind. Later, he would say that this year shaped his entire way of thinking. It was in Aarau that he first imagined himself riding on a beam of light, a thought experiment that would someday revolutionize physics. Einstein graduated from Aarau with high marks, second in his class, and tried again. This time he passed the entrance exam and joined the Polytechnic in Zurich. Finally, it seemed, the door to his dreams had opened. But university life didn't unfold as smoothly as he hoped. Einstein quickly realized that even at the Polytechnic, curiosity could clash with authority. His professors were scholars of rules and routines, Einstein was a rebel of ideas. He rarely attended classes, preferring to teach himself from textbooks or explore questions far beyond the syllabus. He once said, "It is a miracle that curiosity survives formal education." His grades reflected his divided attention. On a scale from 1 to 6, he earned solid 4s in math and higher marks in physics, except for one disastrous score, a 1 in his practical physics course. His professor, Jean Pernet, gave him the lowest grade possible because Einstein often skipped class. When he did attend, he'd ignore the written instructions, toss them aside, and perform the experiment his own way. The other physics professor, Heinrich Weber, initially admired Einstein's energy, but later grew frustrated. Einstein complained that Weber's lectures were outdated, ignoring Maxwell's revolutionary theories of electromagnetism, ideas that fascinated the young student. Einstein's impatience and sharp tongue earned him a reputation for arrogance. Weber never forgave it. That rift would haunt him for years. When Einstein graduated, his classmates easily found assistant teaching jobs at the university. Weber, however, refused to recommend him. He would rather hire engineers than take a chance on the restless dreamer who had challenged him in class. Einstein was the only student in his graduating group who left without a single job offer. The brilliant mind who questioned time and space suddenly found himself unemployed, adrift, and humiliated. But he wasn't entirely alone. During his studies, Einstein had met Mileva Maric, the only woman in his program, a sharp, determined student from Serbia. Mileva shared his passion for physics and his distaste for authority. They spent nights solving equations together, arguing over ideas, dreaming of the future. She checked his calculations, encouraged him when he doubted himself, and became the quiet force behind his confidence. Einstein once wrote to her, "Without you, I lack self-confidence, pleasure in my work, pleasure in life. In short, without you, my life is not life." Their bond grew strong, but not everyone approved. Einstein's parents, especially his mother Pauline, despised the match. She saw Mileva as too plain, too serious, too old for her son, and Serbian, which in their German-Jewish household only made things worse. When Albert announced he wanted to marry her, his mother threw herself on the bed, buried her head in the pillow, and wept like a child. That heartbreak at home only deepened the struggle ahead. Einstein had no money, no job, and now, a love the world told him he couldn't have. And when Mileva became pregnant, the young couple found themselves entangled in a secret that could ruin them both. Far from his family, without a stable income, and shunned by the academic world, the 22-year-old Einstein stood at the edge of uncertainty. The world saw an unemployed graduate. Inside him burned the mind that would soon reshape our understanding of the universe. But for now, he was just a man no one wanted to hire. The years after graduation were some of the darkest in Einstein's life. He wandered the streets of Zurich with a worn coat, pockets empty, clutching letters of recommendation that no one would read. Behind every polite rejection hid the same truth. No professor wanted to hire the student who had questioned their teaching, skipped their classes, and defied their authority. The bright young man who once dreamed of revolutionizing physics couldn't even find a teaching assistant's position. Einstein tried to keep his humor alive. God created the donkey and gave him a thick skin. He joked to his friend Marcel Grossman, another physics student who had managed to land a respectable job. But beneath the wit was quiet despair. Every morning, he awoke to uncertainty, his ambitions shrinking under the weight of hunger and humiliation. Zurich's polite society whispered about him, the brilliant but difficult graduate who couldn't find work. His reputation, they said, had followed him. Some professors, like Weber, had made sure of it. Others simply didn't understand his independent spirit, mistaking it for arrogance. Anti-Semitism also lingered like an invisible wall. The Jewish name Einstein often closed doors before he could knock. Meanwhile, Mileva Maric was facing her own turmoil. Her relationship with Albert had grown more intense and more complicated. When she became pregnant, the news hit like a thunderclap. In early 20th century Europe, an unmarried pregnant woman was a scandal. For Mileva, it could destroy her chances of a career, her dignity, her future. Einstein was trapped too, poor, unemployed, and estranged from his family. They decided to keep the pregnancy secret. In January 1902, in the Serbian town of Novi Sad, Mileva gave birth to a baby girl, Liesl. Einstein never saw her. Whether out of shame, fear, or circumstance, he stayed away. In his letters, he wrote tenderly, "I love her so much and don't even know her yet." But the words were all he could give. Liesl's fate remains one of history's quiet mysteries. Some believe she was adopted by a close friend of Mileva's. Others think she died from scarlet fever before her second birthday. What's certain is that Einstein and Mileva destroyed almost every letter that mentioned her. The world nearly forgot she ever existed. Yet amid grief and secrecy, Einstein refused to surrender his dream. He began writing to universities all across Europe, begging for work. Leipzig, Göttingen, Vienna. He sent letter after letter, each one a mixture of humility and hope. Weeks passed, then months. Silence. In desperation, his father, Hermann Einstein, intervened. Without telling his son, he wrote to Wilhelm Ostwald, a distinguished professor and future Nobel laureate in chemistry. The letter was heartbreaking, the voice of a father pleading for mercy. Please forgive a father who is so bold as to turn to you in the interest of his son, Hermann wrote. My son Albert is 22 years old. He passed his diploma examinations with flying colors last summer. He feels profoundly unhappy with his present lack of position. If you could write him even a few words of encouragement, my gratitude would know no bounds. Ostwald never replied. The silence broke something inside Albert. He began to suspect that Weber, his old professor, had deliberately sabotaged his references. I must have been given a bad recommendation, he told friends bitterly. Otherwise, how could all doors remain shut? He even wondered if his Jewish background played a part. Whatever the reason, it felt as though the universe was conspiring against him. To survive, Einstein took on small tutoring jobs, teaching math and physics to uninterested students. But work was scarce, and the pay was meager. He pawned his possessions, lived on stale bread, and borrowed money from friends. Mileva stood by him, though their love now carried the heavy shadow of disappointment. Then, just when the horizon seemed darkest, help arrived from friendship. Marcel Grossmann, his old classmate, had never forgotten Einstein's brilliance. Grossmann's father happened to know the director of the Swiss patent office in Bern. One recommendation letter later, and Albert Einstein, failed academic and struggling tutor, was hired as a third-class technical expert, a lowly patent clerk. It wasn't the job he dreamed of. He had hoped to teach, to experiment, to live among scholars. Instead, he found himself in a small gray office, reading applications for devices like automatic timestamps and soap dispensers. But Einstein, ever the philosopher, found meaning where others saw monotony. The work demanded precision, imagination, and skepticism, qualities he already possessed in abundance. A worldly cloister, he later called it, a sanctuary where no one could interrupt his thoughts. At the patent office, Einstein's mind began to bloom in ways even he hadn't anticipated. He examined inventions all day, mentally simulating how they functioned. Could a design work better? What hidden principle governed it? Each mechanism became a thought experiment, a puzzle to be solved in the silence of his desk. His supervisor once said that Einstein could do a full day's work in just 2 or 3 hours. The rest of his time, he devoted to thinking. Whenever footsteps approached, he would shove his notes into a drawer and pretend to be engrossed in official paperwork. Beneath that act, the great engine of his imagination never stopped turning. But not everyone saw this quiet transformation. His father, Hermann, was dying, still believing his son had failed. To him, Albert was just a third-class patent clerk, wasting his potential. In October 1902, Hermann Einstein passed away, never knowing that his son was on the verge of changing the world. That winter, Albert finally married Mileva. It was a small civil ceremony, no family, no music, just 2 friends from his informal study group as witnesses. They couldn't afford a honeymoon, so they returned to their modest apartment and began a life built on love, debt, and dreams. Einstein's salary barely covered rent, but his mind was rich with ideas. He began spending nights working on theoretical problems that had haunted him for years. The mysteries of light, motion, and time. He often walked home under the Swiss street lamps, turning invisible questions over in his mind. What if light behaved both as a wave and a particle? What if time wasn't absolute, but relative to motion itself? In that quiet city of Bern, surrounded by ticking clocks and stacks of patent forms, a revolution was quietly being born. The man the world had once ignored was preparing to rewrite its understanding of reality. But before that miracle year could come, Einstein had to endure one more trial. Not of failure, but of revelation. The Swiss Patent Office in Bern was not the birthplace of genius, at least not on the surface. The narrow halls smelled of ink, paper, and oil. The walls were gray, the desks rigid, and the job repetitive. Day after day, Einstein examined technical drawings for electric motors, mechanical pencils, and timekeeping devices. Most men would have been crushed by such monotony. Einstein, however, saw beauty hidden in the machinery. Each diagram was a small mystery. What laws governed its movement? What unseen principles determined its function? While his colleagues read applications line by line, Einstein read between them, into the structure of reality itself. The patent office became his monastery, his laboratory of thought. He later called it a worldly cloister where I hatched my most beautiful ideas. By day, he stamped inventions. By night, he invented the universe. At home, his life was humble but peaceful. He and Mileva lived in a small apartment on Kramgasse Street, above a noisy streetcar line. Their first son, Hans Albert, was born in 1904. Parenthood softened him. Fatherhood gave him a new rhythm, one that alternated between tenderness and restless curiosity. After long days at the office, he would cradle his child, humming Mozart, and then retreat to his desk. where scribbled notes piled high beside half-empty teacups. Money was tight. Einstein's modest government salary barely covered their bills. Mileva, who had once dreamed of a career in science, now spent her days tending to the baby and proofreading her husband's papers. There was love between them still, but also tension. The growing distance between her sacrificed ambition and his relentless pursuit of ideas. It was during this period of quiet struggle that Einstein's mind ignited. In 1905, at the age of 26, he published 5 papers, each of them groundbreaking. The world would later call it his annus mirabilis, his miracle year. The first paper, published in March, tackled a puzzle that had confounded physicists for years. How light could knock electrons off a metal surface, generating electricity. Light was supposed to be a wave, yet it acted as if it were made of particles. Einstein proposed something radical, that light itself was composed of tiny packets of energy, which he called quanta, later known as photons. When these photons struck atoms, they knocked electrons free, creating an electric current. This became known as the photoelectric effect, a discovery so revolutionary it would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize, though not until much later. In April, he turned his attention to something even more abstract, the size of molecules. Using nothing but equations and imagination, he developed a method to measure molecular dimensions indirectly. In doing so, he provided convincing evidence that atoms, once only a philosophical concept, were real, physical entities. By May, he had moved to another mystery, Brownian motion. For decades, scientists had noticed that tiny particles in water seemed to dance under a microscope, jittering endlessly. No one could explain why. Einstein showed that this movement was caused by collisions with invisible water molecules. The experimenters' microscopes couldn't see them, but their effects were undeniable. With this, Einstein breathed life into the atomic theory, the unseen made visible through reason. Then came June, and with it, a revolution. Einstein published a paper titled On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies. It introduced the special theory of relativity. Until that moment, scientists had assumed that time and space were absolute, universal constants that never changed. Einstein shattered that belief. He proposed that time itself could stretch or shrink depending on speed. That simultaneity, the idea that two events can occur at the same time, depended on where you were and how fast you moved. To explain it, he used a simple image. Imagine a train moving down a track. 2 bolts of lightning strike both ends of the train at the same moment. A person standing on the platform might see the flashes as simultaneous, but someone inside the moving train, traveling toward one flash and away from the other, would see the strikes at different times. Neither observer is wrong. They are simply in different frames of reference. Time, Einstein realized, was not fixed. It flowed differently for everyone. Space, too, was not rigid. It bent, it stretched, it moved. Together, they formed a single fabric, space-time. The paper stunned those few who understood it. For everyone else, it was incomprehensible, a strange mix of clarity and chaos that challenged the very foundation of Newtonian physics. But to Einstein, it was elegant simplicity. Time and space are modes by which we think, he once said, not conditions in which we live. After finishing the paper, he collapsed. Exhaustion overcame him. For 2 weeks he lay in bed, while Mileva reviewed his notes and helped refine the math. When he rose again, he had one more flash of insight left. In September 1905, he published a short addendum, just 3 pages long, that would become one of the most famous equations in human history. MC2. Energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. It was simple, beautiful, and terrifying. It meant that matter and energy were 2 sides of the same coin, that a tiny fragment of mass could be transformed into an unimaginable amount of energy. The universe, Einstein realized, was not made of separate things, but of transformations. One essence constantly becoming another. He didn't yet know that this equation would someday unleash the power of the atom, or that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. For now, it was simply the logical conclusion of a chain of thought that had begun years earlier with a boy and his compass. When the year ended, Einstein returned to his gray desk at the patent office, the same as before. Only the universe was different. His papers had been published in Annalen der Physik, one of Germany's top journals, but no flood of offers came. No applause, no fame. The world hadn't yet caught up to him. He was, officially, still a third-class patent clerk. Unofficially, he had rewritten the laws of time, space, and light. In the evenings, when fatigue set in, he would turn to his violin. The melodies of Mozart filled their small apartment, weaving gently with the sound of their son's laughter. "When I play," he once said, "I see the patterns of the universe." For Einstein, music and mathematics were the same. Both spoke a language of harmony. And though the world still ignored him, he didn't mind. He knew that truth, like light, travels slowly, but inevitably, it reaches everything. In the years following his miracle year, Einstein's world changed, but slowly, almost reluctantly. His 5 papers had upended physics, yet recognition came like a hesitant echo. The scientific community needed time to absorb what he had done. For a while, he was still Herr Einstein, the quiet patent clerk who filed inventions by day and dreamed of galaxies by night. His sister Maya remembered how he waited by the mailbox, hoping for letters that never came. He was bitterly disappointed, she said. Icy silence followed the publication. The world hadn't realized that a revolution had already begun. Einstein kept going. In between work at the patent office, he gave lectures to small groups, debated with friends, and tried to finish his PhD. His salary barely supported his growing family. Mileva now cared for 2 small sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, and their cramped apartment echoed with both laughter and fatigue. Mileva was proud, yet weary. She had once been his equal, his partner in equations, but now she felt more like his shadow. Then, in 1909, everything shifted. Alfred Kleiner, a physics professor at the University of Zurich, who had quietly admired Einstein's work, offered him a position as associate professor. After 9 long years of rejection and obscurity, Einstein finally stepped into the world that had once closed its doors to him. He walked into the lecture halls not as the student who challenged authority, but as the man who had reinvented it. His teaching style was unusual, casual, intuitive, almost playful. He wasn't a performer. He was an explorer, guiding others through his labyrinth of thought. His students adored him. In his lectures, equations were not cold symbols, but living creatures, pulsing with energy and mystery. Within months, more offers followed. Prague wanted him. Zurich wanted him back. Berlin, the beating heart of European science, wanted him most of all. The young man once dismissed as undisciplined had become the most sought-after physicist in Europe. But success brought its own storms. The pressures of academia, fame, and expectation began to carve cracks into his marriage. Mileva had sacrificed everything, her studies, her youth, her dreams, for his. Now she watched as the world applauded the man who had once sat hungry beside her in the dark. Letters from this period revealed her pain. She felt left behind, irrelevant, a relic of his struggling years. Einstein, for his part, had changed too. The same independence that once fueled his rebellion against professors now made him restless at home. He found emotional refuge in Berlin, where he reconnected with his cousin Elsa Lowenthal. Elsa was the opposite of Mileva, gentle, nurturing, simple. She didn't challenge his ideas. She soothed his chaos. Their bond deepened, and soon Einstein faced an impossible choice between duty and desire. By the early 1910s, Einstein was a celebrity in scientific circles, yet his personal life was unraveling. He and Mileva grew distant, communicating mostly about their children. His work consumed him entirely. When he wasn't lecturing or writing papers, he was pacing the floor, lost in thought, muttering to himself about light, gravity, and time. His colleagues called him the thinking machine. In 1915, Einstein completed the theory that would make him immortal, the general theory of relativity. While his special theory had described motion at constant speeds, this one dared to explain gravity itself. He realized that gravity wasn't a force in the traditional sense, but the curvature of space-time caused by mass. The sun didn't pull the planets, it bent the fabric of space, and the planets simply followed the curves. He described the insight as the happiest thought of my life. It came to him years earlier, sitting in his chair at the patent office, when he imagined a man falling from a roof. If both the man and his surroundings were falling together, he thought, he wouldn't feel his own weight. That simple idea grew into a monumental theory. General relativity was elegant, but it needed proof. In 1919, nature gave it. During a total solar eclipse, British astronomer Arthur Eddington observed starlight bending around the sun exactly as Einstein had predicted. When the results were announced, headlines screamed across the world, "Lights all askew in the heavens." Overnight, Einstein became a global icon. Crowds gathered wherever he went. Newspapers printed his portrait beside the phrase, "Genius of the Century." His wild hair, kind eyes, and mischievous smile made him an unlikely celebrity, part scientist, part prophet. Reporters followed him everywhere. Even the King of Belgium wanted to meet him. But behind the flashbulbs, his personal life was in ruins. His marriage with Mileva finally collapsed under the strain. Einstein proposed an unthinkable bargain. If she agreed to divorce him, he would give her the money from any future Nobel Prize he might win. Mileva, broken but pragmatic, accepted. They divorced in 1919. 2 years later, he was awarded the Nobel Prize, not for relativity, but for his earlier work on the photoelectric effect. And true to his word, he sent the prize money to her. Now free, Einstein married Elsa, the woman who had offered him comfort when his life was in pieces. She became his companion and protector, managing his schedule and shielding him from the chaos of fame. Together they settled in Berlin, where he continued to refine his theories and correspond with scientists across the globe. Fame suited Einstein awkwardly. He enjoyed the platform it gave him to speak about peace, education, and human rights. But he detested the attention. "It is strange to be known so universally," he wrote, "and yet to be so lonely." The world saw a genius at his peak, but within he wrestled with exhaustion, guilt, and an ever-growing distance from those he loved. He played his violin endlessly, losing himself in Mozart and Bach. "Music helps me think," he said. "When I get stuck in physics, I play." As the 1920s unfolded, Einstein's name became synonymous with modernity itself. To the public, he was proof that the human mind could grasp the divine. But to Einstein, it all still felt fragile. He knew how fickle fame could be. "For every man," he once said, "there are two destinies. One he lives, and one he imagines." He had achieved everything he once dreamed of: recognition, purpose, immortality. But the price was solitude. The same mind that had rewritten the universe now found itself trapped inside it. And soon that universe would turn dark again. A storm was brewing in Germany, one that would challenge everything he believed in: his science, his peace, his very identity. By the late 1920s, Albert Einstein stood as a global icon, a man whose wild white hair and kind, thoughtful eyes had become symbols of genius itself. He had risen from a nameless patent clerk to the face of modern science. Newspapers hailed him as the new Newton, philosophers called him the prophet of relativity, and the public adored his eccentric charm. Yet, fame brought burdens heavier than any equation he had ever solved. He wasn't a man built for celebrity. While the world saw brilliance and certainty, Einstein felt a quiet unease. The attention exhausted him. The press turned his lectures into spectacles. Crowds waited for him outside his home in Berlin, eager for a glimpse of the man who had bent the universe. But inside, he was restless. Science had given him answers about the cosmos, but people, politics, and power were questions far more complex. Berlin in the 1930s was changing, and not for the better. The rise of nationalism and anti-Semitism filled the air like smoke. Posters glorifying strength and purity appeared on walls. Einstein passed every morning on his way to the Prussian Academy. He was a pacifist, a Jew, and an outspoken critic of tyranny. All reasons to be hated by the growing Nazi movement. His fame protected him at first. The world still saw him as untouchable, the genius of relativity, the harmless dreamer. But when the Nazis gained power in 1933, that illusion shattered. His house in Kaputt, a quiet village near Potsdam, where he had spent peaceful summers sailing and writing, was raided. His books were burned in public squares. "If only they had burned my errors," he joked bitterly. But beneath the humor was fear. Einstein made a vow. He would never set foot in Germany again. On October 17, 1933, he arrived in America, a man without a homeland. Princeton University offered him refuge and a position at its newly founded Institute for Advanced Study. There, in a small, modest office filled with stacks of paper, he began the final chapter of his life. But even in exile, suspicion followed him. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, saw his pacifism and humanitarian ties as suspicious. They opened a file on him that would eventually stretch to more than 1,400 pages. Agents watched his lectures, monitored his mail, and listened to his phone calls. To them, Einstein's associations with left-leaning intellectuals and peace activists hinted at subversion. He laughed it off. "I have nothing to hide except my thoughts," he said. Yet, the world around him was becoming increasingly dangerous. In 1939, two fellow scientists, Leo Szilard and Edward Teller, approached him with terrifying news. German physicists might be close to building a weapon based on nuclear fission, a bomb of unimaginable power. Reluctantly, Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that such a weapon could give Hitler the means to dominate the world. That letter would change history. It spurred the creation of the Manhattan Project, the American program that would eventually build the atomic bomb. Einstein himself played no part in the project, but his equation, E=mc2, had laid the theoretical groundwork for converting matter into energy. When the bomb exploded over Hiroshima in August 1945, Einstein's name was tied to it forever. He was devastated. "Oh my God," he said quietly upon hearing the news. For a man who had dedicated his life to peace and understanding, the knowledge that his discoveries had helped create the most destructive weapon in history was unbearable. He spent the rest of his life campaigning against war and nuclear proliferation, joining organizations that promoted global disarmament and the idea of a unified world government. "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything," he warned, "except our way of thinking." But Einstein's contradictions ran deep. The same man who denounced nationalism supported the founding of a Jewish state in Palestine after witnessing the horrors of anti-Semitism. The same pacifist who opposed weapons once urged the United States to arm itself in defense of freedom. He was human, brilliant, flawed, evolving, forever questioning even his own convictions. In his later years at Princeton, Einstein became something of a sage. His home was modest, his daily routine simple. He walked to the institute in worn slippers, refusing to wear socks, his pockets stuffed with notes and crumbs for the stray cats he fed along the way. Students adored him for his humility. He answered every letter he could, from scientists, school children, and even skeptics. When asked for advice on life, he often said, "Try not to become a man of success, but rather try to become a man of value." Yet, he was not done searching. Fame, comfort, and age had not dulled his curiosity. He turned his mind toward the greatest mystery of all, the dream of a unified field theory, a single framework that could explain every force in the universe, linking gravity, electromagnetism, and quantum phenomena into one elegant structure. It was an impossible task, one that eluded even him. Quantum mechanics, the wild new science of uncertainty, frustrated him deeply. He admired its precision, but distrusted its randomness. "God does not play dice with the universe," he said. To him, the idea that existence was governed by chance felt wrong, incomplete. He believed there must be hidden laws, an underlying order that made everything fit together perfectly. His colleagues admired his persistence, but knew the world was moving past him. The new generation of physicists, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, embraced the chaos of quantum theory. They debated Einstein endlessly, sometimes teasing him with affection, sometimes with exasperation. Bohr would smile and reply, "Stop telling God what to do." But Einstein refused to give up. For decades, he worked alone, his desk buried under layers of scribbled equations, trying to bridge the gap between the known and the unknown. He often said the pursuit itself was enough, that the search for truth mattered more than its discovery. "The important thing," he wrote, "is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence." Outside his window, the 1950s world raced ahead. Television, rockets, nuclear fears, the Cold War. Politicians invoked his name as a symbol of intellect, even as they misunderstood his warnings. He remained a quiet rebel to the end, championing peace, civil rights, and intellectual freedom. When segregationists in America criticized him for befriending black activists, he responded simply, "Racism is a disease of white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it." In his final days, his health began to fail. The aneurysm in his abdominal aorta grew worse, but he refused surgery. "It is tasteless," he said, "to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go." Even in decline, he continued to work. Visitors to his hospital room in Princeton found pages of equations scattered across his bedside table, his last attempt to finish the unified theory. On April 18, 1955, at the age of 76, Albert Einstein passed away. A nurse reported that his final words were in German, words she could not understand. Perhaps they were a farewell, or perhaps one last thought about the universe that had consumed his life. On the nightstand beside him lay 12 handwritten pages of calculations, the final traces of a man still searching for order in the infinite. His brain was later preserved for study, a controversial act he never consented to. Scientists found nothing superhuman in its structure, only a slightly denser network of connections in the regions associated with visualization and reasoning. The secret of his genius was not in the shape of his brain, but in the shape of his curiosity. Einstein's legacy lives far beyond equations. He changed how we see time, space, and reality itself. But more than that, he showed humanity that wonder is the highest form of intelligence. He believed that mystery was not something to be feared but embraced. The most beautiful experience we can have, he once wrote, is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. And so, the man who couldn't find a job for 9 years became the man who redefined the cosmos. He proved that even from failure can rise a force powerful enough to bend the universe. His story reminds us that genius is not about being right, but about daring to ask the questions no one else will. In the quiet of his final night, surrounded by the soft hum of machines and the smell of ink and paper, Einstein left behind not an answer, but a question. The same question that had haunted him since the day his father showed him a compass. What is it that moves the world?